The ins and outs of mystery writing. It was kind of a challenge to take up this topic when Julie presented it to me. I thought, well, ins and outs, that kind of implies the finer points, the details. And so I thought I would approach it from the standpoint, we have a lot of readers here, but also a fair number of writers who are probably watching. So I thought I'd share with you my writing approach to crafting an engrossing mystery. And I'm Chris Norbury. My qualifications, such as they are, is that I'm an award-winning author of the mystery thrillers Straight River and Castle Danger. So I'm going to, as we go through the slides, I'm going to tell you kind of what my approach is to deciding on my plot, on my style, on my subgenre, those sorts of things. So we'll talk a little bit about the overall facets of writing a mystery, and then I'll give you some specifics. I'm going to use my book Straight River as an illustration for characters and plot and theme and things like that. So we'll get her started and see how she goes here. First of all, what we're going to talk about, mystery is kind of a nebulous category. Anything that basically is got some crime involved could be called a mystery, but there's all different types of subgenres. So we're going to define it first, then we'll talk about all those subgenres, and then tell you about some of the unique characteristics of mysteries, the components that you have to have, and then there's a certain structure that the good ones follow. It's not an exact structure, but it's a general framework, and how point of view comes into play as well. That is probably one of the more important things for especially writers who like to write in first person, because you can really get into some style ideas and things like that, and separate your book from the crowd. And we're just going to talk about adult mystery fiction today. There's kids mysteries like Nancy Drew and Harriet the Spy and Hardy Boys and stuff like that. But we're just going to talk about adult fiction, and for the most part. So definition, and this is from literaryterms.net. The simple sentence: a puzzling crime situation or circumstance that needs to be solved. From the Latin mysterium, a secret thing. So there is secrecy involved, crimes, some situation, something that needs to be figured out. Can be fictional or non-fictional. Non-fictional would be the mystery of the unsolved crime from 20 years ago. Who did it? Where are they? How'd they get away? That sort of thing. But we're going to talk just about fictional today, of course, creating mysteries that people like to read. Many mysteries involve a whodunit scenario. The mystery revolves around the uncovering a culprit or the crime, and that's the whole thing, is what happens, who did it, and why. And we're going to basically use modern mysteries, starting from about Edgar Allan Poe's time. You can see him on the right side there. He's kind of credited as being the first American mystery writer of any note, and things kind of took off from there. But in the US anyway, mysteries really gained some traction starting in about the 20s or 30s or 40s with all the detective noir things and the pulp fiction and stuff like that. So we're going to basically talk about modern day, 20th century or later mysteries, with the exception of one of the 10 great Sherlock Holmes. So subgenres, I jotted down or could figure out 10 really quickly, and I'm sure there's probably 10 more that some of you may have heard about. Different styles, different things, and then there's you could also have mashups or combination, call them subgenres, where you take, say, an amateur sleuth and then dig down a little bit farther. But these are 10 that kind of jumped out at me. And just to clarify, we're going to include thrillers and suspense in with mysteries, because they also have that criminal element. They have, it's not necessarily a whodunit, but sometimes it's a why done it. Or one of the great definitions of a thriller is, and the difference between that and a mystery is that a mystery, the crime happens and you solve the crime and catch the bad guy. In a thriller, you're not sure what's going to happen. You know something's bad's going to happen, and you try and stop it from happening. So the classic example would be the terrorist who's going to blow up a plane or something like that, and you have to try and catch them before they commit the crime. So we'll include thrillers because one of the other problems is that thrillers, or I'm sorry, genres get mixed and matched and described. And any of you authors out there know that if you've tried to use the Amazon feature to describe your mysteries or your stories, you can choose from all sorts of different genres, and depending on that, it would be where it would end up being placed in on the bookshelves or in the how they are rated or compared on the Amazon ratings, for example. So it's really hard to nail it down, but you can kind of hone in. So the first one, probably the one that leaps to mind for most people, is the police procedural or the detective mystery. And these are the classic detectives on the police force. A crime happens in their jurisdiction. They go to the scene, they examine the evidence. They, usually, oftentimes with most popular ones, it's a dead body. They start to investigate, they ask around, they work their way through it, and by the end of the book, the mystery is solved. So that's probably the one that would be the classical definition of a mystery. Then you've got standard private eye and hard-boiled, or noir, as some people call it. It's kind of, once again, terms that can be interchanged. Private eyes have the big advantage or big advantage over police detectives is that they're not necessarily bound by the bureaucracy of their department. They don't have to do so much in the way of politics. They can kind of bend the rules a little bit or break the law to get what they want sometimes. They tend to be a little bit more, I don't know, daring and not really worried about playing by the rules, so to speak. So you've got, let me go back one sec. The police procedurals, just to mention a couple of detective type novels. Any of you who read Michael Connelly have heard of Harry Bosch, the detective in Los Angeles, who's kind of a rogue cop. He doesn't always play by the rules, and he's kind of a noirish sort of a figure, I guess. Another one, which has a lot of atmosphere and ambiance to it, James Lee Burke's novels set down in Louisiana with Dave Robichaux, who's a detective. I think it's with New Orleans Police Department or somewhere down in the Bayou area. And then one that I've read over the years, and I kind of enjoy them. They're a little bit different. Is J.A. Jance's detective in Seattle, J.P. Beaumont, and he's kind of a throwback guy. She wrote hers starting probably back in the 80s or 90s. And J.P. Beaumont is kind of a guy who would have fit in really well in the 1960s with Sergeant Joe Friday, and then his partner, Bill Gannon, kind of that, kind of rough, gruff, tough, likes to drink, and, kind of a no-nonsense sort of a guy. Then you get into the private eyes, which would be something like Robert Parker's Spencer series, Sue Grafton's Kinsey Malone, and then a couple of the great ones, Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade, Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe, and then one of my particular favorites of a modern day author, Dennis Lehane, writes out of Boston, and he's got a couple, I think they're married. I haven't read his books in a while, but Patrick Kinsey and Angela Gennaro are a husband and wife, or a couple anyway, private eyes who solve all these mysteries, and they get to be kind of noirish too, but I don't know if he would call it specifically noirish. But so, like I said, there is a lot of overlap between those first two. Third subgenre that a lot of people don't think about, and I hadn't really thought about this before either, and I've read maybe one or two over the years, is the inverted detective, and that's what we could call a how catch 'em. The crime is shown at the beginning of the book, and the perpetrator, oops, I got to get my screen out of the way here to see what my thing says. The perpetrator is known to the readers, but the main character doesn't know. So you see the crime committed right away at the beginning, and then you follow along and see if the detective can solve the crime and how they go about doing that. So it sounds kind of backwards, like, well, I already know who did it. Why do I need to read the book? But you want to read the book to see how the detective caught the person. That's the interesting part of that. And the best example that jumps out there is Peter Falk in the TV series Columbo, back in the 70s and 80s, I believe. The guy with the trench coat, and he always had a cigar in his mouth, and kind of an old-fashioned guy. And then also, just for more modern reference, Stephen King wrote a book that's pretty well known in that genre called Mr. Mercedes, where once again the crime, you see the crime happen right away, you know who did it, and you watch the crime being solved by the main character. Historical mysteries are definitely possible. That would be mysteries that take place before the time of the writer. It doesn't just mean that they're old mysteries, because Conan Doyle wasn't writing historical mysteries when he wrote Sherlock Holmes. But we look at those from a historical aspect. But for example, one of my favorites in the historical genre is Ken Follett's Eye of the Needle. That's a mystery that takes place back in World War II. I think it's with a German spy, and then a woman alone on the coast of England somewhere, kind of isolated and everything. And then an author that I'm not familiar with, other than I've heard his name and I'm aware of the series, a man named Ellis Peters, actually a woman who uses the name Ellis Peters. She wrote the Brother Cadfael series, which takes place in medieval England. And there you've got an example of something historical. What would it be like to try and solve mysteries 800 years ago with whatever forensic abilities and detective abilities they had then and capabilities versus what we have now? It would be a totally different ballgame. And then cozies are a very popular genre. There's all shapes and sizes and colors and styles of those. The key criteria for those is, and this is a stylistic thing, there's no graphic sex or violence, and they tend to have very clean or no explicit language for the most part, maybe a few hells and damns here, but not gritty and hard-boiled and rough language and stuff like that. No gory details for how the murderer, cut off somebody's face and whatever. And they usually star an amateur sleuth. Not always, but usually that's the common way. And for some reason, they tend to be female protagonists. It is kind of, I don't know exactly why that's true. I'm sure there's plenty of male protagonists in cozies, but most of the ones I've seen star a female protagonist. And the other thing about the cozies, they're often in small towns. They don't have to be, but often in small towns or rural areas or whatever it might be. And they are often themed. A writer will hook onto one particular theme that all their stories revolve around. And it seems to be broken down into groups like food-themed cozies, or craft-themed cozies, or book club cozies, or little old ladies, buddies hanging out and doing and solving crimes in their spare time. So that's another example of those. You could have kids cozy mysteries too, just because you wouldn't want to have anything explicit in a kid's murder mystery. Great examples in the cozy genre are Miss Jane Marple, Agatha Christie's classic character. For TV, not that this is a book, but it might have been a book actually. Jessica Fletcher from Murder, She Wrote. And Charlaine Harris has written a series featuring Aurora Teagarden. And I can't remember the theme of those, but I didn't jot that down. Another one that comes to mind is Alexander McCall Smith's The #1 Ladies Detective Agency. And I think that takes place in Africa, if I'm not mistaken. And finally, there's another one that's kind of a little bit of a crossover, but Louise Penny's got a series, very popular, the Three Pines Mystery Series, featuring Chief Inspector Armand Gamache. And my wife is a huge fan of his. And they're more or less cozies, but I haven't read all of them. They might have some tough language, but she doesn't like, Louise Penny doesn't like to get real graphic or anything like that. And then you could also have animal cozies. Rita Mae Brown is an author who writes animal cozy mysteries for her readers. And then the amateur sleuth, like I said, that's, and let me point out right now, that anything that you see highlighted in green, those are my choices for what I did with Straight River. So my book is features an amateur sleuth, and basically I had all these options to choose from, plus many more. But when I was thinking about writing the book and starting the series, I thought, what do I want to be writing about? And I thought the most interesting thing for me, since I'm not an ex-cop, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, and can't write confidently in those genres, is that just a regular guy who gets involved in something and gets in over his head really quick and has to fight his way out of it. I thought that would be a really interesting concept. So I went with the amateur sleuth. Matt Lanier is my main character, and he happens to be a professional musician, which is about as far from fighting crime as you might imagine being, because all he wants to do is, play in his orchestra and play with his jazz trio. But all of a sudden circumstances plunge him into this holy mess. And basically in the first book, I take this normal, happy guy and I ruin his life. So that's how I chose that. Locked Room is another one that's kind of a very pretty smaller genre, I guess, but there's some great examples of that. And that's basically whenever you've got a group of suspects and a crime has been committed or is going to be committed, and they're all in the same place and they can't get away from each other. So one that leaps to mind instantly is Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. The murders happen on a train that's going, across Europe to wherever it ends up in the East, and it takes place that way. Another one I just read, which is considered one of Christie's best, is called And Then There Were None. And that takes place, 10 people get invited to this island off the coast of England, and they start dying one by one, and nobody can get on, nobody can get off. And the question is, who's killing all these people? And it's got a really interesting twist at the end, and it's kind of a cool thing. But Locked Room is just basically, you can't get away from people. The criminal, the crook can't get away, and all the suspects are stuck there too. And then I'll just gloss over these quickly, but the medical thriller would be books like Robin Cook's Coma, Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain. Tess Gerritsen does another kind of a subgenre of medical thrillers with her Rizzoli and Isles series. Rizzoli is a detective, Isles is a medical examiner or a forensic pathologist, and they solve crimes together. Lisa Scatolini has a legal, whoops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself there. And then Patricia Cornwell does her Case Scarpetta series, and Case Scarpetta is a medical examiner who helps solve crimes with her particular skill set. So medical ones, they don't have to be medical examiners. They don't have to be the doctor solving the mystery in the hospital, but they deal with issues like organ harvesting or pandemics maybe, or like Andromeda strain or viruses coming in, that sort of deal that you need a doctor to get in the middle of it and kind of figure things out. So then the legal thrillers, once again, pretty self-explanatory. Probably the dean of those are the original legal thriller authors was Earl Stanley Gardner, who wrote the Perry Mason books, probably set the standard for all legal thrillers to come. The current king, I would say easily, hands down, is John Grisham. Pretty obvious there. He's one of the best sellers and basically writes most of his books, or all of his books, are legal thrillers. And one interesting thing that I've noticed in my reading and my being a writer and associating with writers is that a lot of best-selling authors, especially in crime literature, are current or former lawyers. For whatever reason, they tend to be pretty decent. David Baldacci is one. There's others, and I don't know if there's a correlation between that, but it's kind of cool that lawyers. I mean, but I'd rather have a lawyer writing a book than being in court and charging me $500 an hour to solve my case. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's neither here nor there. And then you got science fiction, occult, fantasy, Paranormal, those, once again, subgenres of subgenres, and you can go all the way there. You can set it in the future, set it in the past, give characters magical abilities. So that's one of the first things that I, as an author, have to decide on is how am I gonna write this story? What genre am I gonna use? And then each genre has got its own kind of set of rules that you follow along, or guidelines. So the quote or semi-quotes, more or less unique characteristics of mysteries. What readers like is a mental challenge. They want to try and solve the crime before the detective does. My big thing was Sherlock Holmes. I read probably every Sherlock Holmes book when I was a kid, and I, for the life of me, couldn't figure out how he solved that crime so amazingly fast and easily. And I was scratching my head trying to figure out what's going on. So that's one of the things that readers look for. That's why they like a good mystery. They want to be challenged. They don't want to escape necessarily. They don't want a fantasy. They don't want a romantic love story. Maybe there's some romance in there, but they want their brain to be exercised. And of course, mysteries usually deal with the dark side of humanity and society, because if you have a crime committed, that means somebody is doing something quote unquote wrong. And so there's crime involved, there's evil intent, greed and power and egos and hate and lust, and all these things come into play. So unless you're doing a cozy where the one lady is sabotaging the county fair pie baking contest by putting some poison on somebody's pie and killing the judges, they generally, and even then that's the dark side. But unless it's a really kind of fluffy, cozy mystery with not any major crime, most of them are on the dark side. And then what readers want to see is a battle of wits and skill between the protagonist and antagonist. If the crime is a run-of-the-mill murder and it's just some guy who isn't good at all about hiding or getting away, and the detective solves it in about an hour, we don't want to read about that. We want to read about a challenge where the antagonist is seriously talented or seriously motivated, and the protagonist is challenged to use all of their wits, their intellect, their investigative skills to solve that crime. And that's what I chose for one of the key things I chose for my story. I have Dark Side of Humanity. I have a lot of crimes and stuff in my book, all sorts of various types. Let's see here. But I've got a battle of wits between the antagonist, who's basically untouchable. He's hiding behind this layers and layers and layers of phony corporations and people doing his dirty work. And I've got an average musician who all he has is his talents as a musician, and he's a very intelligent guy. But so there's a monumental battle, the basically a David against Goliath sort of a thing. And there's definitely a mental challenge, because my big challenge in Straight River is, how is this one guy who can't trust literally anybody towards the end of the book, how is he going to prevail and at least get some measure of satisfaction with the people he's trying to help? And then mysteries do have to be plot driven. You have to solve the crime. You can't have a crime committed and then nothing happens. No one solves it by the end of the book. It's got to be plot driven, and that's compared with things like literary fiction or memoirs, or things that are more about interesting characters doing interesting things, but there's not necessarily a goal to be achieved that involves solving a crime, or that takes up the majority of the plot. And that's, once again, kind of debatable, and like I say, most genres are just, you can do them any way you want to, and you can call it this or that or whatever, and whether it is remains to be seen by the reader. But a good story is a good story. And then one of the really interesting things, and something that people don't think about too much, is that, let's see here, okay, is that not all information or facts are presented to the reader as the story unfolds. Writers will use what we call selective editing, where you leave out key pieces of information in a hopefully tricky, not too tricky and not too irritating way. For example, in a detective story, a detective is goes to a house or an apartment. He's looking around, looking for some sort of clues. He opens a desk drawer, pulls out an envelope. There's a letter inside. He reads the letter. He gets this look over his face of clouded anger or surprise or the aha moment, and he puts the letter in his pocket and rushes out the door to go somewhere. And so that's the author not telling you what's in that letter right away, but the promise is that you will find out sooner than eventually what's in that letter, but it keeps you turning the page. And that's one of the tricks that is tricky. It's hard to do. Well, it's easy to do. Just you can leave out all sorts of stuff and leave the reader guessing. But I've read a lot of books by really well-known authors where they do this selective editing too much, and there's all these gaps in the information, and I'm starting to get a little annoyed. And you may have read books like that too. So you want to use it judiciously. And I for me, I did try to do that in my book. That was a big part of it. And another way is having characters lie. There's one character who, actually a couple who are duplicitous, but there's one big one who's actually, when he comes around, that's a turning point in the story. So you, the reader, are going on the information that the author presents to you, but the author won't say that this character's lying until it's revealed 20 pages later or 50 pages later that, oh, this guy, he turned out to be not what we thought he was going to be. And then another great way to do it that's actually relatively easy is just doing first person POV, point of view, where you normally it is used in a lot of detective novels and a lot of hard-boiled or noir with the private eyes. They're taking you through the case. They're saying it was a dark and stormy night, and so-and-so walked in the office and hired me to solve this crime. And that's where you can get into some really unique, interesting styles, because you, the writer, are assuming the personality of the narrator, which is the main character. And so that's why the hard-boiled noir ones are so fun to read, because you feel like you're hanging out with Philip Marlowe and he's telling you the story and filling in the gaps and all that. And it's a lot different than this, say, an omniscient narrator who said Marlowe went down to the bar and talked to so-and-so. So that's a relatively easy way to withhold some facts, because in first person, the character can only know what they experience themselves or what other people tell them. If the detective is driving downtown to go to some place, and then the criminal is committing another murder across town, the reader can't know that, and the detective can't know that until somebody tells him later on. So that's one of the neat ways that mysteries can be different, is that you can leave out certain facts, and other genres can do that too, but it's probably more useful in mystery writing. And the other thing about a character lies brings up the point of the unreliable narrator. And that's a narrator, could be first person or third or whatever, whoever's head we are in the certain scene or the certain book, is somebody that we either don't trust right off the bat, or we maybe realize, oh, they were lying through their teeth all the way through. And a great example of this, very popular, I'm sure it was probably close to a #1 bestseller, is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. It turned out, I won't give away the plot, but both main characters were unreliable narrators, because we were seeing the story through their eyes, but they were lying like crazy. And that's a good way to keep you guessing, because kind of the challenges there is, can you see through the lies and go, wait a minute, something's not quite right here. Another one that's recent was pretty good book was The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. She was the character, the girl on the train, was an alcoholic. She lost her job. She kept riding this train back and forth, and she saw things, and she was telling this to police and investigators and stuff, and it turns out that she wasn't as reliable as we originally thought she was too. So those are some of the unique things that make a mystery more special than some other genres. And then the necessary components. These are the things that you have to make it be a true mystery. First of all, we mentioned it before, a crime must be committed, whatever that crime is. So we want to find out who done it. It's got to be committed and it has to be solved. There can be a bunch of crimes committed and some remain unsolved, but the main one that we're most concerned about as the reader should be solved. They almost always need a human protagonist and a human villain or criminal, and that there could be, you could have subgenres. I read a couple of books where what was it, a cat was a protagonist and is trying to solve some sort of a mystery, but that the animals would communicate with each other. I think Rita Mae Brown probably her books might be like that. And then you could also have, getting off into some of the other subgenres, you could have fantasy characters who are not human, but they're evil people. I suppose Darth Vader might qualify as a non-human antagonist or villain and criminal. So things like that. But you need to have this protagonist and a villain. You have to have these opposing forces against each other. You have to have a minimum number of characters in a mystery, and the more the merrier, but not too many. If it's just the protagonist and the antagonist commits a crime and the protagonist knows he's the only guy who did it, there's no mystery there because you don't wonder. You have to have at least one other suspect, but then it's going to be a pretty short book because you figure out that one guy's lying, the other guy's telling the truth. But you don't want to overdo it. Not like a family saga when you've got dozens of characters over decades and generations. And I think, but then you can because you can overdo it in a mystery, you want to have plenty of suspects and things like that. But you also want to have at least one villain, maybe some multiple villains. In my book, I've got the main guy, the brains behind the operation, and then I have 3 men who are working for him in various capacities, and they're doing their part of the dirty work, and they're insulating him from the realities and from being discovered. And then you've got sidekicks for the protagonist. Maybe if it's a detective, there's a partner who works together. They work the crimes together. My amateur sleuth has got old friends from his hometown who help him out. He actually recruits his ex-wife to help him out a little bit, and he finds a college kid who's really good on computers to balance him off, to fill in his gaps with technical skills. And so I introduced those. There's victims. There's one or more victims. There's friends of the family, friends of people, all this. So you want to have enough, but like say, you don't want to have 37 suspects and then have a book that takes 1,000 pages to whittle down those suspects into the top 1 or 2. And the reason I say not too many characters is that I recently read a financial thriller, and in the first 40 pages, the author introduced no less than 20 different characters, and also, because it's a financial thriller, threw in the names of a dozen or so companies. And after 40 pages, I stopped and I said, I'm getting really lost here. So I went back and counted, and I counted all these up, and I said, that's way too many characters because I don't know them very well. I don't really care what they're doing or why they're doing it, and I can't keep these companies' names straight. So the reason you want to lean towards fewer than less is that you can develop your characters more, but you need to have a balance. Most of us operate in a circle of people in our world, and it's not just us against the world. And so you have to have that kind of a realistic balance as far as that goes. Then there has to be a sense of urgency. The heroine and the hero can't dabble at solving the case. There's got to be, there either could be a time pressure, like stop the serial killer is a big one. That's why serial killer books are great, because you know that the clock is ticking, and then especially when they can't find the guy right away, and 2 or 3 more bodies turn up, and the pressure's really on. The police chief is yelling at the detectives, and the newspapers are screaming, and everybody's panicking. So you want to have that sense of urgency. You can't have the crime happen and the heroine goes, oh, well, maybe I'll do that, check on that tomorrow when I feel like it. And so you have to have that urgency there, and that creates tension, creates suspense. And then structure is also kind of necessary. We'll talk about that on the next slide, but you want to have kind of a beginning, middle section, and end. And there's only one basic way that the book can proceed if you're solving a crime. And the first off, of course, you have to have the dead body or the crime being committed. And like I say, I put in my book, I have lots of dead bodies. So I've got plenty of murders. I've got the conspiracy theory, which is the overarching. I've got blackmail involved. I've got bribery involved. I've got extortion involved. That's just what I thought off the top of my head. If I dug deeper, I could probably, lying and cheating and that sort of thing. So you got to have that crime, but you can do it any way you want to. The crime can be as simple as, somebody shoplifting from a store and shoplifting diamonds, or how they get into the jewel case, or it could be mass murderer, or some huge thing like a nuclear bomb going to blow up an entire city. Then the protagonist, like I say, there's all sorts of ways you can go on that. Amateur sleuth is great because you can pretty much pick anybody. Detectives, you're kind of locked into the standard police lieutenant or sergeant or whoever it might be. But it also could be a wrong person who seeks justice. Something happened terrible to somebody, and he's going to find out who it is, whether it's a detective or anybody else. Could be an FBI or CIA agent, or a corporate or government spy, or that group of cute little old ladies who are trying to solve the, who messed up the county fair pie contest. And the antagonist can be almost anybody you can think of. You want to make them worthy of your protagonist, though. Somebody who's going to challenge him. If it's, like I say, if it's just a penny ante crook, no big deal. But I put in my evil real estate tycoon as my antagonist, and he's a multi-millionaire. He wants to be a multi-billionaire. He knows everybody in state politics. He's got bankers. He's got in his pocket, he's got policemen in his pocket. He's got all sorts of people all over the place. He's like this puppet master, just controlling all these strings all over the state, all over the Midwest, actually. So that's what he's going for there. And then why is point number 4, the setting. Big city, small town, remote locations, locked room, whatever. I use big city. Twin Cities is where my Straight River is set a good part of the time. Small town, Straight River, Minnesota, southern Minnesota farming town. Remote location, Boundary Waters Canoe Area up in northern Minnesota. Each setting can bring you a different set of options, a different set of restrictions for how you can write your mystery. And I use 3 of them, so there's a nice variety in there. And then 5th, the case has to be important to the protagonist. Like I said, if you don't care, why do you want to read it? If the protagonist doesn't care, why should we, the reader, care? And for my book, Matt's father's death was connected to the conspiracy. So once he finds that out, he shifts into high gear and says, wait a minute, this is not right. I'm going to make this right. Plus, he's got a neighbor who he's trying to help out too, who may lose her farm if he doesn't help her out. And then the hero's journey, you writers probably are familiar with that, but the hero's journey is basically, if you think of Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars movies, or Frodo in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where they've got their normal life and it's upset by something, they have to go on this quest, or they're forced into this journey where they have to prevail, and they learn and they develop and they change and they grow. And for me, it's my normal guy gets his life turned upside down, and he has to work his butt off to overcome those powerful forces that he's up against. And he like I say, basically I end up ruining his life. in the space of one book and turn him into this fugitive who can't trust anybody. So those are some that's where it gets really fun to play with, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, where is it going to be set, whether you're going to have a hero's journey or not. And then the structure, we'll go through this a little bit on the quick side, pretty self-explanatory. You want to have the crime occur early on, not necessarily page 1, but first couple chapters or so, because if there's no crime to solve and you take half the book before you have a crime, what happens in that first half? Nothing too exciting necessarily, because if a reader is reading a mystery, they want to know soon what the crime was so they can start thinking and trying to solve it themselves. You have to introduce the hero or heroine pretty soon, early on. You want to get to know them before they take off. Then you've got that compelling reason. It helps to have a why it's important to the main character. Otherwise, we don't really care as a reader. With thrillers and suspense, you usually want to introduce that villain or signs that the villain is active in that first 25% or so. Because otherwise, if there's this unknown entity who's causing trouble, we don't necessarily really care too much, other than it's hurting a lot of people. And then throughout, you're going to have the detective work. Once the hero starts to investigate, this will be what weaves everything together is the trail they take to investigate, to get evidence, to talk to people. And then point 6, you find the suspects, you close in on the villain, you eliminate them, or you get closer to the truth. Like in my case, Matt pretty much knows what's going on, but he wants to prove it. That's his thing, is he can't prove any of the things that he's seen because everybody ends up dead who's there with him, so he has no witnesses. And then the dodging bullets part could be real or figurative. Red herrings, like I say, characters who lie, and then you find out that they were lying later on, and so you have to retrace or head off in another direction. Plot twists, somebody you think might be the guilty party turns up dead, and so you realize, well, they're dead. They can't have killed so and so because that happened after they were dead. Or new information comes in. You finally get somebody to crack, or your detective work pulls up a lead and someone gives you a key piece of information, but you still have to kind of work your way through those and sort out what's right, what's wrong, what makes sense, what's the most logical. And then the subplots are really important too. Most people don't want to read just a straight procedural. That would read kind of dry, because we want to get to know our main characters, or all of our characters, but our main character especially. So we want to know, do they have a romantic life? Do they have issues with girlfriends or boyfriends or husbands or wives, or somebody they're working with they're attracted to? Is there work-related issues, friction between detective partners, for example, or political pressure from the captain of the police force down to the detective because it's a high-profile case and they want it solved yesterday, and the cop is saying, hey, I'm working my butt off, I can't do this here. Or friend or family issues. Great one is, I think, a Cork O'Connor. We get to know his family, his wife and his 3 kids really well, and we watch his kids grow up through the progression of the 18 or so books that he's got. They start off as young kids in grade school and high school, and end up all adults by the last book in the series so far. So that connects us with the main character, connects us with the stories of the series, and we really care about these people. Not so much, there's a little bit less importance on solving the crime, but what's going to happen to the kids in this one, or what's going to happen to the main character with the romance that he's working on. And then eventually the case gets solved, and or the villain gets defeated. My ending, I set up a sequel, so the villain doesn't get defeated, but Matt solves the case. At least a couple of them, he gets things tied up. And then there's the last part, the last chapter or 2 or a few pages, it's going to be tie up loose ends and subplots. So that's the general structure. You can play with that, but you've got to have those elements working through in that general order to make the story work. Okay, quick on point of view. How am I doing on time? Not too bad. First person, like I said, that works great for the standard private eye or detective novels, the noir things in the police procedurals, because then you've got, basically, it's, if you think of meeting a a detective at the bar, and he tells you the story of how he solved this crime. And you could imagine sitting around drinking a beer with a guy, and he takes you through step by step, and you get the privatized personality, or the detective's personality can shine through, and the author can do a lot of fun things with that. Second person, not very common. I just mentioned it just so you know that it's out there, and I don't know that I've ever read a mystery that uses a second person point of view, but that's where the narrator, you the writer, are telling the reader, you felt this, you went there, you caught the crook. So you are placed into the position of the main character, which gives you a lot more sense of immediacy or intimacy and being right there. But it's kind of an awkward way to read, and the ones I've read, it takes you a long time to sort of get into the rhythm of what that's like. But it does work. It's just a little bit tricky to make that go well and do it easily. And then the third person is excellent for thrillers, especially if one of the points of view is that of the villain, the serial killer. And my Straight River, Matt is the main point of view in third person. I'm describing him, what he's doing, what he's thinking, but I have several scenes and several chapters where one or more of the villains is the protagonist, or is the main, is the point of view, and we're getting inside their head, seeing what they're seeing. I'm filling in a little information about what Matt wants to know, but maybe won't find out right away, that is going on the other side of town, on the literal other side of town, when you know, he's trying to save himself and he doesn't know what's going to happen next. Omniscient is probably less common now than it was 100 years ago, but that's where the narrator as God idea, where you can, the narrator, you the author, can get into any of the characters' heads and see the story from their perspective and share their thoughts and actions at any time during the story. The only problem with that, and since it's not so common anymore, and a lot of writers think, maybe newer writers might think it's a good way to write a book, is that I'm in everybody's head, but you get what you call head hopping, where you're jumping from one character's thoughts and feelings to another character's in the same scene, and the readers tend to get confused because they don't know who's thinking what, who's saying what, and it's a little bit tricky. But that way you can kind of get that view from on high of what the whole scope of the story, and if you do it well, it can be an interesting way, because you can see all these things coming together from all the different points of view and know what everybody's thinking at the moment. So there's some advantages to it, but it's like I say, less common than it was a long time ago. And then finally, just a note on tense. Most authors write in past tense rather than present, because we're storytellers. We're telling a story. We're usually relating what happened. But you can also do present tense. I've read some books that are in present tense, and the advantage to those is that you go into a little bit more of an immediacy and a doubt of what's going to happen, because in past tense, if say the Philip Marlowe is telling you the story in first person, you know that he stays alive through the entire story because he's telling the story that happened, last week or last month. But if you've got a present tense, you don't know for sure that the main character is going to survive to the end of the book, because you're living it in the moment, and that's the idea that the author is doing. The only problem with that is that when you have present tense and in a book, but you know that so-and-so author has written 20 books and you're reading the first one, you know that, okay, the main character is going to survive for this one book, even though it's in present tense. But it's basically kind of a minor point, but I most do in past tense, and I wrote mine in past tense. And then let's talk about research a little bit. This is kind of gets overlooked for a lot of writers, but unless you're an expert in a field or what you're writing about, like a lawyer writing legal thrillers, you need to talk to or interview or do research, interview experts So you can have a great deal of believability in your book. It doesn't have to be totally 100% factual, but it helps. And the reason I stress that is that so many people these days read books and they like to pick it apart for the errors, the faux pas that the writer made. And if you ever read a crime expert named Lee Laughlin, he's a former police officer. He writes a blog, a daily blog, and his big pet peeve is the smell of cordite. And he says cordite has not been used in explosives since World War II. So any book that takes place after that, there's no such thing as the bomb going off and the smell of cordite. And so things like that. But there are people who love to point out all these inaccuracies and make a deal out of it. But if you do your research, basic research, and you know enough to make it be believable, that's fine. I do my research, but then maybe I learn a whole bunch about something, but I write in more general terms, so I can't get called on it directly by anybody. And that's why it's also good to not name names or exact addresses or living people or landmarks in small towns that you maybe aren't 100% sure about, because people will call you and say, hey, no, that building was built in 1920, not 1950. So what are you talking about? One thing, a word of warning, you may spend as much time researching your book as you spend writing your book. Hopefully I haven't done that, but it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole and avoid writing. And you become this expert on whatever. And just to give you an idea of what I've researched on the book I'm working on now, just a short list of things, but I researched the FBI, weapons, spy gear, Beatles lyrics, autopsy reports, computer hacking, a place called Nanabuju Lodge up on the North Shore, illegal drugs, Bitcoin, tasers, the Malak bands of Ojibwe, and the Minneapolis street map. So it's all sorts of things you can do. And I've got about 150 bookmarks of research. And if I just spent 30 minutes on each of those pages or bookmarks, that would be 75 hours of my writing time spent just reading or just researching, and that's time that I'm not writing. So you have to factor that in. And then that's pretty much the main part of it. I just thought I'd compile a list of well-known, renowned mystery authors and give you a couple of titles in case you want to try them. If you've never read Agatha Christie, for example, there's a few highly recommended books that she wrote, all-time best-selling author, and basically defined the modern mystery genre along with Conan Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle. Raymond Chandler, The Big Sleep, it absolutely blew me away when I read it a year or two ago. I'm going to try and read all of his books. He's just totally different style and amazing. Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes things, you owe it to yourself to read at least some of those. And Sue Grafton almost got through the alphabet. She got to Y, I believe, in her Kinsey Malone series, classic female private eye in a noirish style. And then John Grisham, of course, James Patterson, one of the all-time greats. Alex Cross is a psychologist and a detective. So he does, the Alex Cross books tend to deal with the psychological thriller type thing or crimes dealing with psychopaths and sociopaths, serial killers. Louise Penny, as I mentioned, really, really good, huge following on those. And Patricia Cornwell, the K. Scarpetta, forensic or medical thrillers, because this is just a general list. There's hundreds, thousands, and more that you could read, just some suggestions. And I'll have these if you really want to know these. I know you didn't have time maybe to jot them all down. Send me an email and I will send you this list, or you can just do some searches and look for popular mysteries. Also, a lot of Minnesota and regional authors. William Kent Kruger, I mentioned, he's one of my favorites. He actually kind of inspired me to start writing and setting my books in Minnesota. And I was kind of inspired by his Sheriff Cork O'Connor. I didn't think I could do a character as good as him, but really, really fun books to read and really captivating. John Sanford is another classic. He's a big name. His Prey series featuring Lucas Davenport, who's a detective for the Minneapolis Police Department, who writes computer games, in his quote unquote spare time. Tammy Hogue does her Deer Lake series as kind of a romantic suspense features. Brian Freeman, Jonathan Stride is a Duluth police lieutenant detective, kind of a darkish, noirish police procedural. Another one I didn't mention before, but Julie Kramer does a nice job with her Riley Sparks series. And you've got an investigative TV reporter who is helping the police solve crimes by, looking for a really good TV story and getting it right in the middle of the action. A different approach to that. Brian Litterman is another excellent local author, St. Paul guy. His Penn Wilkinson series of corporate thrillers. And the interesting thing about Penn is that she's paraplegic. She's an attorney. And then Ellen Hart, her series, Jane Lawless, an amateur sleuth who is a lesbian, another subgenre. And Jess Lurie, Mayday, of the Myra James series, an amateur sleuth and some cozy, but also with some humor in that. And I do want to mention there are several authors participating in the festival this weekend who are also mystery thriller authors. I'll give them a quick shout out, and I think a couple of them are here anyway. Julie Holmes, her novel features a female airplane mechanic. Frank Weber writes psychological oriented true crime mysteries. And then Melinda Falgoose, who I'm not familiar with, but I notice she does thrillers too. So check those authors out as well. And then I'll give you a little bit of a plug for me, just so you know if you're interested in reading my books after this. Those are the first two, and I've got a third one on the way featuring Matt Lanier. And I think that's all I've got. If we have time for some questions, I'd be happy to answer those. I do have one that I want to get to real quick that was sent in earlier from Carrie Johns Griffith. She basically wanted to know, am I a pantser or a plotter? And that's someone who just starts writing the story and has it develop, or someone who plans it out, outlines and things like that. I am a little bit of each. My first book, Straight River, probably about 80-20 pantsing versus plotting. I came up with a general idea for a character, a setting, wanted to have a conspiracy, wanted to have it be a regular guy, set it in Minnesota, and then I just started writing. Castle Danger, the second one, probably did about 60-40 pantsing versus plotting. A little bit more of an outline, a little bit more idea what I wanted to have in the story. And then the book I'm working on now is probably 20% pantsing and 80% plotting. I wrote about a 15,000 word outline, and it then I ended up changing a whole bunch of stuff anyway. So that's the way that goes. I had a couple that I saw in the Q&A. Terry Hansen asked which of yours was first. I think she meant which of my books, and Straight River is the first one in the series. So I would definitely recommend reading that one. I wrote them as standalones, but it helps to know from the beginning what Matt gets into, because there's a backstory and things like that that are nice to know for Castle Danger and then for the third book. And then someone who is anonymous said, is the use of red herrings a dying trope in mystery writing? If not, how do you do them well? I don't know if it's a trope. I think maybe the term red herrings isn't used all that much, but it's basically the idea of misdirection and leading the main character on a wild goose chase, so to speak, or sending them in the wrong direction, or making them think one thing when it's really another thing. So the trick to do them well is to make them kind of work. At least for me, I really like to have the red herrings or the misdirections make sense in the overall plot of the story. You don't have one where you say, hey, I think I saw one of the suspects out in California, and you know that everything's going on locally and there's no reason that anybody would be in California. So you want to have it something that is kind of organic to the plot, I guess. And so red herring, like say, it's kind of a whatever you want to, whatever you do it, but it's got to be something that works in context of the story. And then Susan asked, who is the paraplegic pen mystery author again? Brian Litterman, Lutterman. I think I can go back and get him. let's see, how do I go backwards here? Brian Litterman, yeah, there he is down the towards the bottom there, and Penn Wilkinson. And when I read the first one, I read 2 or 3 of them. When I read the first one, I was thinking to myself, it's going to be hard to make this believable that there's an attorney who's going around, dealing with these corporate crimes and things like that. But Brian really makes it work quite well. And after a while, you just accept that, okay, she's in a wheelchair, she's got to get around, and it puts her in a little bit more danger than the average person. But he makes it work really well. So he's got a nice niche, I guess you could say, he carved out for himself. Thanks to everybody, and stay tuned for the next show at 4 o'clock, and also the drawing tonight and tomorrow, all the activities tomorrow during the day. I appreciated the chance to talk to you, and happy reading.